those two.
They passed Nina along the way people pass along old furniture. Something too worn to value, yet still useful enough to remove from one room and push into another. There was no music, no laughter, no warm circle of women blessing her future, no aunties adjusting her dress with tears in their eyes, no gentle prayer over the life she was stepping into. Only a fast arrangement in a hot sitting room, a few stiff greetings, and the cold, private relief on her uncle's face as he convinced himself that, at last, after years of feeding and housing and resenting her, he had finally found a way to move a burden out of his house. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe to my channel. The man they gave her to arrived in a faded brown coat that looked as if too much sun and too many seasons had rubbed it nearly colorless. In one hand, he carried a carved walking cane. On his feet were sandals worn thin at the edges, the soles curling upward with age. His beard was trimmed, but everything else about him suggested modest means, quiet habits, and a life that had taught him not to expect much from anyone. He spoke softly. He sat carefully. And he never looked anyone in the eye for longer than politeness required. To Uncle George, that was ideal. To Aunt Susan, even better. To her cousins, Diana and Ruby, it was the funniest thing they had seen in a long time. And to Nina, it felt like the last door in her life had shut without even having the decency to make a sound. But sometimes, the door that closes behind you is not there to punish you. Sometimes it is there to protect you. And sometimes the person everyone in the room is laughing at is the only one who truly sees you. Nina was 19, though grief had aged her far beyond the number of years she had lived. Not in her face. Her face was still young, still soft, still carrying the calm kind of beauty that made strangers look twice before they realized she was the same girl scrubbing the front veranda, carrying basins bigger than her waist, or hurrying toward the roadside kiosk with coins wrapped into the corner of her scarf. It was her eyes that belonged to someone older. Eyes that had watched her mother grow thinner week by week until sickness finally carried her away. Eyes that had watched neighbors lower their voices after her father failed to return from the road accident. Eyes that had learned, far too early, that people could speak of mercy while making sure you stayed hungry. After her parents died, she was taken into the home of her father's older brother, Uncle George. The neighborhood praised him endlessly. George is a good man. He brought his late brother's daughter into his own home. God will bless that family for this. Nina heard such things often. She also heard what the walls heard. Don't take too much rice. This is not your father's table. Why are you standing like a princess? Go and wash the plates. If we had left you where you were, who knows what kind of street girl you would have become. Aunt Susan had a special gift for speaking loudly, the way some people do when they want cruelty to sound like truth, simply because other people are near enough to hear it. Every morning, before the first rooster had finished calling the day awake, Nina was already on her feet. She swept the compound before the neighbors opened their doors. She lit the charcoal stove. She boiled water. She washed uniforms. She braided Ruby's hair on the rare mornings Ruby was in a gentle mood and endured Ruby's insults on the many mornings she was not. She ironed Uncle George's shirts until the cheap iron nearly scorched her wrist. She walked to the market for tomatoes, onions, kerosene, detergent, salt, and matches. She hand-washed wrappers, socks, towels, sheets, and school clothes until her fingers wrinkled and stung. When the soap finished, she scrubbed blackened pots with ash. If visitors came, she served them. If anything went missing, she was blamed. If anything broke, she was questioned. And if anything good happened in the house, her name was never mentioned at all. Still, there was one thing her relatives could not quite crush. Not because Nina was loud, not because she fought back, and not because anyone defended her, but because she had made a private decision deep inside herself without ever announcing it to the world. Pain would not teach her how to become hard. So even after being criticized all morning, she still helped old Mama Grace carry her basket from the bus stop. Even after Aunt Susan mocked her torn slippers, Nina still split her bean cake in half and gave a share to the little boy who sold sachet water at the junction. Even after Diana laughed at the worn-out seam in her blouse, Nina still repaired Diana's skirt when it tore an hour before church. Women in the neighborhood noticed. "She is a good girl," some of them whispered. "She greets properly. There is suffering in her life, but there is no bitterness in her mouth." Inside Uncle George's house, none of that mattered. Outside, it became Nina's only wealth. The trouble began because Nina was not trying to be noticed. If she had been vain, if she had flirted, if she had chased attention or leaned into the beauty she could not help carrying, perhaps her cousins would have hated her less. But Nina did nothing. That was the problem. She simply existed. And somehow, whenever young men came to visit Uncle George's daughters, their eyes drifted toward the girl in the background. The first was a junior bank officer who came with biscuits and bottled drinks to see Diana. Nina entered the sitting room only to place cups on the center table. She wore a washed-out blue gown, no jewelry, no face powder, and her hair was tied back with black thread. She said, "Good evening," and left. Later, after pretending to discuss football with Uncle George, the young man asked casually, "Sir, the other girl who brought the tray, is she your niece?" The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Uncle George laughed too loudly. "That one? No, no. Let us talk about Diana." The bank officer did not return. Then came a tailor from the next district who had shown interest in Ruby. He smiled and joked and accepted refreshments until Nina passed through the back hallway carrying folded laundry. "She has a very peaceful face," he said afterward, not realizing his words would strike the house like a match falling into dry grass. That night, Diana refused to eat dinner. Ruby cried without tears. Aunt Susan dragged Nina into the kitchen and gripped her arm so tightly that half-moon nail marks remained on her skin. "What exactly are you doing?" she hissed. "Nothing, Auntie." "Don't lie to me. Men come here for my daughters and leave asking about you. Who told you to stand where they can see you?" Nina lowered her eyes. "I was only serving them." "Then from now on, serve and disappear." Uncle George was worse, because it was not only his daughter's pride that had been bruised. His own pride had been touched, and pride in a small man can be a dangerous thing. That evening he sat in the sitting room after supper with a toothpick in his mouth and anger lying just beneath his skin. "I know girls like you," he said, pointing at Nina. "The quiet ones are always the most dangerous. You act innocent, but you know exactly what you are doing. Using your face to spoil chances for others." Nina said nothing. He leaned forward. "Listen carefully. The kind of husband my daughters deserve will not be distracted because of one orphan hiding under my roof. Since these men are looking where they should not look, I will settle the matter myself. The first useless man who comes asking for you, I will give you to him immediately. No delay, no complaint. And then you will learn that beauty without family backing is dust." Those words entered Nina like cold rain, not because she believed them, but because she knew he meant every one of them. From that day onward, the house drew tighter around her. Aunt Susan made sure Nina remained in the backyard whenever visitors came. Diana and Ruby stopped hiding their mockery. "Be careful. Another husband may faint if he sees her. Maybe we should rub pepper on her face. It may help. At this rate, she will marry a man who owns one shirt and one plate." Nina bore it the way some people bear heat in the dry season, with no umbrella, no complaint, and nowhere else to stand. There are pains you survive not by being strong, but simply by having no other road. Weeks passed. Then one Tuesday afternoon, while the sun hung heavily over the zinc roofs and the compound smelled of dust, soap water, and boiled cassava, the gate creaked open and a stranger stepped inside. Nina was in the yard washing cassava roots in a metal basin. She heard the tap of wood against concrete before she looked up. A man stood near the entrance with a small travel bag over one shoulder and a walking cane in his right hand. He limped slightly, not enough to make him helpless, only enough to make him move more slowly than other men. His coat had a patch at one elbow. His trousers were clean but old. A scar crossed one side of his chin, half hidden by his beard. He did not look broken. He looked controlled, contained, like a man who had spent years allowing people to underestimate him. "Good afternoon," he said. His voice was calm, educated, and unexpectedly gentle. Nina straightened. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm looking for Mr. George Blake." "He's inside," she said. Before she could turn away, he added, "Thank you." Very few people thanked her for anything in that house. It was such a small courtesy that it stayed with her longer than it should have. She led him to the veranda and brought him water without being asked. When she handed him the glass, he looked at her properly, not greedily, not carelessly, not like she was invisible. "May your day be kind," he said. Nina blinked, surprised. "And yours too, sir." Inside, she heard voices rising and settling. Aunt Susan's fake sweetness floated out into the yard. Uncle George's laugh followed. Diana and Ruby suddenly found urgent reasons to change clothes, adjust earrings, and smooth their wigs. Nina returned to the cassava basin, but she listened. Not to the words, to the tone. Tone reveals what language tries to hide. The stranger introduced himself as Daniel. He said he traded in farm equipment and machine parts, moving between towns and districts. His business was not large, but it kept him alive. He had no impressive family parade with him, no polished car outside, no loud display of status. He had come because an older pastor in another district told him George Blake had daughters of marriageable age. At once, Nina understood why her cousins were suddenly glowing like peacocks before rain. And yet, less than an hour later, the wind shifted. She knew because Diana came storming into the yard with her face dark and her bracelets rattling. "Imagine," she snapped, "a dusty man with a stick." Ruby followed behind her, whispering harshly. "He said, not me, not you, her." Then, both of them turned toward Nina and stared, as if she had somehow changed the sky. "What did you do?" Diana demanded. Nina rose slowly. "Nothing." "You always say that," Ruby shouted. "Do you use charms? Is that it? Men come here and suddenly forget who they came for?" Nina said nothing, because truth is often too weak a defense against jealousy. That evening, after the stranger had gone, Uncle George called everyone into the sitting room. His face carried a strange brightness. It was the kind of brightness that appears when cruelty finds an opportunity and begins dressing itself as wisdom. "Nina," he said, "come forward." She stood before him. "That man who came today, Daniel, has asked for your hand in marriage." The room erupted before she could speak. Aunt Susan clapped once in delight. "At last! God has settled it!" Diana threw back her head and laughed. "It has finally happened!" Ruby sang softly under her breath. "Nina and the Cane Man. Nina and the Cane Man." Nina's lips parted. "Uncle, I don't know him." "You will know him in marriage." "I have barely spoken to him." "You do not need long conversation to become a wife." Her heartbeat lost its rhythm. "Please, Uncle." His face hardened instantly. "Did I ask for your opinion? Have you forgotten who feeds you? Or have you started imagining that you deserve choices in this house?" Aunt Susan folded her arms. "A girl who came here with no bag and no bed now wants standards." Uncle George pointed toward the doorway, as if dismissing a worker. "The matter is settled. He will return with elders on Saturday. By next week, you will be married." Nina stood very still. Sometimes humiliation is loud. Sometimes it is simply the moment you realize everyone in the room has silently agreed that you are not fully a person. That night, she lay on a thin mattress beside the kitchen wall and stared into the dark. Dogs barked somewhere beyond the compound. A baby cried in the next yard. Far away, a radio played a slow, old love song. Nina pressed her wrist over her mouth so her breathing would not sound like sobbing. She was not afraid of poverty. She already knew poverty too well. What frightened her was entering another life with no witness, no protection, and no say. She was afraid of belonging to a man whose face she did not yet understand. Afraid that perhaps kindness had been foolish all along. And still, when morning came, she got up and boiled water for everyone else. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to my channel. Daniel returned 3 days later. This time he came earlier, just before noon, when Aunt Susan had gone to the market for fish and pepper, and Uncle George was still at the neighbor's mechanic shed, discussing politics as if the country would repair itself if only people heard his opinions loudly enough. Only Diana and Ruby were inside, oiling their hair and arguing over a borrowed handbag. Nina was at the back of the house, hanging washed clothes on the line. When she heard the soft tap of the cane against the wall, she turned. Daniel stood there, not too close. "I'm sorry," he said. "I asked the younger girl if I could wait in the yard." Nina nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence did not feel dangerous. It felt careful. Then Daniel said, "I know this arrangement was not your choice." Nina looked down at the damp cloth in her hands. "Very little in my life has been my choice." He accepted that without rushing to fill the space. "I won't pretend what your uncle is doing is noble," he said quietly. "It isn't." Nina frowned slightly. That was not what she expected to hear from a man seeking the uncle's permission. "Then why are you agreeing?" she asked. His eyes moved briefly toward the clothes lifting and dropping in the breeze. "Because I came for you." The words were simple, but they made her fingers tighten around the wooden peg she was holding. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough to ask." "How?" "I have seen you before." That startled her. He continued, "At the roadside, 2 weeks ago, when the rain started. You pulled an old woman under the shop awning before finding shelter for yourself. The next day, I saw you at the market. A tomato seller dropped her tray, and everyone stepped over her goods. You knelt to help gather them. And last week, outside this gate, a little boy was crying because another boy stole his bread. You gave him yours." Nina searched her memory. She remembered each moment clearly. She did not remember him. Maybe because no one imagines they are being watched when they are simply being themselves. "You watched me?" she asked. "I observed," he said calmly. "There is a difference." His answer nearly pulled a smile from her, but the smile faded quickly. "You look poor," she said before she could stop herself. He inclined his head. "Yes." "You limp." "Yes." "My uncle thinks he is punishing me by handing me to you." "I know." "Doesn't that insult you?" A small shadow of humor passed through his eyes. "It does, but not enough to stop me." She looked at him more openly then. He was not handsome in the polished way that made girls whisper in corners, but there was something steady about him. His shoulders were straight. His words carried weight. Even his worn clothes seemed chosen rather than accidental. "What kind of life are you offering?" she asked softly. "An honest one." "That is a small answer." "It is also a rare one." The breeze lifted the edge of a shirt hanging between them. Nina swallowed. "You may be kind," she said, "but I'm still afraid." "That is fair."
What if you change after marriage? Then I will be the liar, not you. What if you were only saying all this to make me agree? He rested both hands lightly on the top of his cane. Then time will expose me. There was no urgency in him, no performance, no pressure, only patience. Then he said the one thing that entered her heart and remained there. If you come with me and find no peace, I will not cage you. Nina stared at him. I don't want a prisoner, he continued. I don't want a servant. If all you can offer me at first is honesty, then give me honesty. I can wait for the rest. No one had ever spoken to her as if her comfort mattered. Even when neighbors were kind, their kindness had limits. A plate of food, a second-hand blouse, a quick prayer, a sympathetic look. This was something else. This was room. And room is a powerful gift to someone who has spent years crowded by other people's anger. Before she could answer, Diana's voice broke across the yard. Nina, stop standing there gossiping and come clean the blender. Daniel stepped back at once. I did not come to trouble you, he said. I only wanted you to hear one truth from my own mouth. Whatever else happens, I will not dishonor you. He turned and walked toward the front of the house. For one brief second, before he remembered the rhythm of his limp, his stride looked almost even. Nina noticed. And that small detail joined the growing list of things about him that did not quite fit. Saturday brought the formal visit. 2 older men arrived with Daniel, both simply dressed.
One carried cola nuts wrapped in white cloth. The other spoke very little, but seemed to observe everything. They offered greetings, sat modestly, and confirmed that Daniel wished to marry Nina. No one asked what Nina wanted. Uncle George handled the entire discussion with the satisfaction of a man disposing of goods that had taken up too much space in his storeroom. There is no need for too much ceremony, he said grandly. We are simple people. What he meant was this. Let the matter finish quickly before another man with better shoes changed his mind and asked for Nina instead. Aunt Susan agreed too quickly. Diana and Ruby sat like offended queens, pretending boredom while listening to every word. Bride gifts were mentioned. There was no open insult in the language, but insult lived in the speed of it all. By evening, everything was settled. The wedding would be small, immediate, efficient. Nina was told, never asked. On the Monday before the wedding, Aunt Susan threw a wrapped bundle onto Nina's mattress. Wear this on Friday. Nina unfolded it and found a pale green dress that had clearly once belonged to Diana. The side seam had been altered badly, one sleeve pulled tighter than the other. Near the waist was a faint oil stain no scrubbing had managed to remove. Auntie, Nina began. Aunt Susan turned sharply. Do you want imported lace from London? No. Then wear it and thank God. Nina nodded. Later that night, Mama Grace from next door slipped in through the side gate with a tiny packet of shea butter and a pair of earrings missing one small stone. They are not new, she whispered, but from far away nobody will know. For the first time in many days, Nina laughed softly. Thank you, Mama. Mama Grace cupped her face. Listen to me. A woman's road can be strange. Sometimes what looks like disgrace is only disguise. Walk with prayer. Nina carried those words inside her chest all the way to Friday. The wedding itself was so small it almost felt hidden. A local pastor came wiping sweat from his forehead. A plastic table stood in the middle of the sitting room with a Bible, a pen, and one artificial flower leaning sideways in a bottle. Uncle George wore his best outfit and his usual self-importance. Aunt Susan tied her head wrap too high, as if height could transform bitterness into class. Diana and Ruby sat together, looking like they had come to witness a punishment rather than a marriage. Nina entered last. The green dress fit badly, but she stood straight inside it. Her hair was neatly packed back. Mama Grace's earrings glinted faintly against her neck. She wore no makeup. She had no bouquet. No mother to straighten her hem. No father to bless her forehead. Only herself. Daniel was already seated. His clothes were still modest but cleaner than before. The old coat was gone, replaced with a plain dark tunic. His cane rested against his chair. When Nina sat opposite him, he did not stare or smile too broadly. He simply gave her one quiet look that seemed to say, "I am here. I am steady." The pastor cleared his throat. He read quickly from Scripture. Marriage is patience. Marriage is kindness. Marriage is faithfulness. Words everyone knows. Words few people honor. Then came the vows. "Daniel Kingsley, do you take Nina Blake to be your lawful wife?" "I do," he answered. His voice did not shake. "Nina Blake, do you take Daniel Kingsley to be your lawful husband?" The room held its breath. Nina looked toward Uncle George and saw no love there, no concern, not even duty, only impatience. She looked at Aunt Susan and saw relief. At Diana and Ruby, satisfaction. Then she looked at Daniel. And in his face she saw the one thing none of the others had ever given her. Respect. Not pity, not performance. Respect. "I do," she said softly. The pastor pronounced them husband and wife. No joyful cry rose. No one wept with happiness. No money was sprayed. Aunt Susan muttered, "At last." Uncle George shook Daniel's hand the way a man might finalize a delivery. And that was all. Nina's old life ended with less celebration than a child's naming ceremony. As she stepped outside, her heart beat wildly. She expected they would walk toward the road and board a crowded minibus to whatever narrow rented room would now become her home. Instead, under the jacaranda tree outside the compound, a dark silver vehicle waited. Not flashy, not decorated, but expensive. Nina slowed. A driver in a crisp white shirt stepped forward immediately and opened the back door. "Good afternoon, sir," he said to Daniel with easy formality. Then he turned to Nina. "Welcome, madam." For a second she thought he was mocking her, but his face held no joke. Daniel gestured gently. "Please." Nina entered the car in stunned silence. The door closed with a soft, expensive sound. Cool air surrounded her. For a few moments, all she could hear was the hum of the engine and the pounding of her own pulse. Outside, Uncle George's compound began shrinking behind them. Nina turned slowly toward her husband. "Who are you?" she asked. Daniel held her gaze. "A man who keeps his word," he said. "That is not an answer." "No," he admitted. "It is only the beginning of one." The car moved through busy streets, then quieter roads, then into an area Nina had only seen through the windows of buses. Wide avenues, trimmed hedges, security gates, houses sitting far back from the road as though privacy itself were a form of wealth. She glanced out, then back at him. "This is not where poor traders live." "No." "And your driver called you sir." "Yes." "You don't really limp, do you?" At that, he almost smiled. "I injured my leg years ago. The pain is real enough. I simply allow people to notice it more than necessary." Nina stared at him. Nothing in her life had prepared her for this kind of confusion. The car passed through black iron gates and rolled into a compound so large it seemed to carry its own silence. Trees lined the driveway. Warm lights glowed along the path. A fountain murmured in the center of a circular garden. The house ahead was not merely big, it was deliberate, elegant, strong, restrained. A few staff members stood by the entrance. Not enough to look like a palace. enough to make it clear that this was a house accustomed to order. As Nina stepped out, they greeted together. "Welcome home, sir." "Welcome home, madam." Home. That word struck harder than the gates, the car, the fountain, or the house itself, because nobody had ever said it to Nina as if they truly meant it. Daniel did not press her for questions that night. He led her through polished floors and framed art she did not know how to interpret, down a quieter wing of the house. "This room is yours," he said. "Not ours. Yours." That, too, she noticed. The room held a wide bed, a writing desk, wine-colored curtains, a bookshelf, and a wardrobe already filled with clothes in simple cuts and gentle colors. Not extravagant, considered. On the bedside table sat a glass of water and a plate of sliced fruit. Nina stood in the doorway, unable to move. "If it feels like too much tonight," Daniel said, "rest first. Questions can come tomorrow." She turned to him. "Why would you do all this for someone you barely know?" His answer came slowly. "Because I understood your house before I entered it." Then he said nothing more, and he left her alone to breathe. That night, Nina did not sleep quickly. She walked from the wardrobe to the window, from the window to the mirror, from the mirror back to the bed. She touched the curtains, opened and closed drawers, sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at her own reflection, half expecting Aunt Susan to burst in and accuse her of stealing another person's life. But the room remained quiet, and for the first time in years, silence did not mean fear. It meant safety. The truth began unfolding the next morning. At breakfast, Daniel wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit. No faded coat, no worn sandals, no attempt to appear smaller than he was. His posture had not changed, yet now the whole house seemed to fit around him, like something that had long ago learned his name. A woman in her 50s served tea and addressed him as Mr. Kingsley. Another entered carrying files. A phone rang twice before he answered, speaking in measured tones about ports, shipments, warehouse delays, procurement, school construction deadlines, and budget approvals. Nina sat quietly, collecting the pieces. At last, he put the phone down and looked at her. "My full name," he said, "is Daniel Edward Kingsley." The name landed like distant thunder. Nina knew it. Everyone knew it. Kingsley Group, transport, agricultural equipment, building materials, rural clinics, scholarships, warehousing. His company name appeared on billboards, trucks, donation banners, radio adverts. She had heard neighbors speak about him in the tone reserved for men ordinary people never expect to meet. And now, here he was, pouring tea into her cup. "You," she began, then stopped. "Yes." "Then why did you come to my uncle's house dressed like that?" He folded his hands and leaned back slightly. "Because years ago, your uncle helped destroy my mother's business." Nina went cold. Daniel continued before she could speak. "My mother built her first transport route with 2 old trucks, a rented office, and more faith than wisdom. She carried produce from farm districts to city wholesalers. She was honest, demanding, and too trusting. Your uncle worked under her when he was younger. He handled field payments and fuel paperwork in one of the outer routes." Nina did not move. "He learned quickly," Daniel said. "Not discipline, opportunity." His voice did not rise. If anything, it became quieter. One difficult season, when fertilizer prices rose and fuel became unstable, several contractors were paid in advance. My mother believed the routes would recover. Instead, money began disappearing. Receipts were forged. Deliveries were redirected. Debts piled up under her company's name while others ate from the confusion. "Uncle George?" Nina whispered. "Yes." "He always said he once worked for a major company." "He did." Daniel's eyes moved briefly toward the garden. When the losses became severe, everyone blamed my mother. Not the men beneath her, not the staff who falsified the records. Her. Investors pulled back. Credit tightened. Creditors came. She sold land, then trucks, then jewelry. The financial damage was one thing. The shame was another. Shame broke her more than the losses. Nina's throat tightened. What happened to her? She survived the scandal, Daniel said. Barely. But she never forgave herself for trusting the wrong people. Before she died, she told me something I never forgot. He looked directly at Nina. She said, "Wealth hides character. If you want to know the truth about a house, enter it with less than they respect." The words settled between them. I spent years rebuilding, he said. Quietly, carefully. Sometimes as myself, sometimes not. I visited workshops, farms, markets, churches, councils. I learned more in plain clothes than I ever would have learned in a convoy. And you went to my uncle's house to test them? I went because I had heard things first. Rumors about a family keeping an orphan girl like unpaid labor. Stories about suitors coming for the daughters and leaving confused because the niece outshone them without trying. I wanted to see if the stories were exaggerated. He shook his head slightly. They were not exaggerated. Nina looked down at her teacup. No, she said quietly. They were not. I also wanted to know whether anyone in that house still recognized humanity when it arrived looking poor, Daniel said. His gaze softened. You did. Nina could not speak for several moments. She had expected pride in his story, perhaps revenge. Instead, beneath all of it, she heard grief. You married me because I gave you water? She asked at last, almost unable to believe it. A faint smile touched his mouth. Not only because of that. Because you gave it without contempt. Because you saw a stranger and did not perform kindness for applause. Because pain had not taught you to despise weakness. He sat back. I did not choose you out of pity, Nina. I chose you because character is rare. Beauty gets attention. Character survives truth. No one had ever described her that way. In Uncle George's house, she had been a mouth to feed, a face to hide, a pair of hands to command. Here, for the first time, someone spoke of her value without asking her to prove it first. Healing did not arrive all at once. That is not how healing works. Nina did not wake in a beautiful room and become free overnight. Freedom had to travel through her slowly, through old reflexes, deep fear, and habits formed under years of humiliation. The first time a housekeeper asked, "Madam, what would you like for breakfast?" Nina answered, "Anything," and then apologized for having a preference at all. The first time Daniel told her to sit while others cleared the table, she stood automatically anyway. The first time she accidentally spilled water near the staircase, she froze, waiting for accusation. None came. Day after day, the absence of cruelty began teaching her a new language. Rest. Choice. Dignity. At the far side of the house, there was a room that drew her again and again. It had belonged to Daniel's mother. Not a bedroom, a workroom. Shelves lined one wall. On another hung framed sketches of blouses, dresses, wrappers, uniforms, aprons, and fitted jackets. A heavy cutting table stood in the middle. 2 sewing machines rested under white cloth covers. There were baskets of thread sorted by color, old measuring tapes, chalk, scissors, and ledgers filled with neat handwriting. She designed school uniforms first, Daniel told her one afternoon. Then market aprons and practical work clothes for women. She believed clothing should help people stand straight. Nina touched one of the ledgers with care. "This room still feels alive," she whispered. "It does," Daniel replied. "That is why I kept it." Soon, she began spending more time there. At first, she only looked, Then she cleaned. Then she sketched sleeve shapes on scrap paper. Then she repaired a torn apron one of the staff had nearly thrown away. Daniel noticed, but never interrupted the process by turning it into a performance. One evening, while rain tapped softly against the veranda and darkened the garden soil, he asked, "If pain had not interrupted your life, what would you have wanted to become?" Nina thought for a long while. "When I was very small, a teacher," she said. "Later, maybe someone who made clothes." "Why clothes?" "Because when something is made with care," she said, "the person wearing it feels seen." He nodded as though she had said something deeply important. Because she had. A week later, he brought her books on pattern making, garment construction, and small business planning. Along with them came a notebook. On the first page, he had written one sentence: "Build what your past tried to deny you." Nina read it 3 times before closing the notebook against her chest. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to my channel. News travels faster than shame, and gossip travels faster than both. Within a month, someone from Uncle George's street had seen Nina stepping out of Daniel's car after a community meeting. Another person had recognized the Kingsley Group seal on a file folder in the driver's hand. Someone else had heard staff address her as Mrs. Kingsley. By the time the story reached her old neighborhood, it no longer walked. It sprinted. People who once laughed at the Cane Man began retelling events differently. He was testing them. "That girl was always blessed. I said from the start she was special." No one rewrites history faster than the people who fear being remembered accurately. Uncle George arrived at Daniel's house on a blazing Thursday afternoon. He did not come with apology. He came with entitlement. The guard called inside first. Daniel, who had been reviewing documents in his study, turned to Nina and asked quietly, "Do you want to see him?" Nina's stomach tightened. She thought of the oil-stained dress, of sleeping hungry while Aunt Susan locked away food, of being ordered not to stand where visitors could see her, of years spent shrinking inside rooms that never once called her daughter. "Yes," she said. Uncle George entered the sitting room with the exaggerated confidence of a man determined not to look intimidated by polished floors and expensive silence. Aunt Susan came behind him, wrapped in perfume and imitation dignity. Diana and Ruby trailed after them, suddenly polite, suddenly subdued, suddenly aware that the world had turned without asking their permission and left them staring at the girl they used to mock. Nina came down the staircase in a simple cream dress. No heavy jewelry. No dramatic entrance. She did not need one. Their expressions changed the moment they saw her. Not because she had become dazzling, but because peace had changed her. There is a kind of beauty that appears only when fear leaves a person's shoulders. Aunt Susan recovered first. "My daughter!" she cried, opening her arms wide. Nina stopped at a respectful distance. Aunt Susan's embrace closed around empty air. Uncle George cleared his throat and attempted a smile. "Nina, my child, you have not visited. We were beginning to worry." Nina almost admired the boldness of the lie. Daniel entered then and greeted them with the same controlled politeness he had used on the day they thought him poor. "Mr. Blake? Mrs. Blake?" They sat. Tea was brought. No one touched it. At last, Uncle George leaned forward. "Well," he began, "it is clear that God has blessed this union beyond expectation." "God has indeed been kind," Daniel replied. Yes, very kind." George forced a laugh. "So I felt it proper to discuss family matters, tradition, respect, certain obligations. You understand." Nina watched his face. Even here, surrounded by proof of his own smallness, greed sat inside him without shame. Daniel's expression did not change. "What obligations do you mean?" George spread his hands.
A man of your standing does not simply marry into a family and disappear. There are customary recognitions, support.
Since Nina was raised under my roof, naturally, certain responsibilities are due. Diana and Ruby lowered their eyes, embarrassed but silent. Aunt Susan quickly added, "Not because we are asking for ourselves, of course. It is just culture." Daniel turned to Nina. "Would you like to answer?" He was giving her the room. Nina drew one slow breath. "Uncle," she said, "which part of my raising should we calculate first?" Silence fell instantly. She continued, her voice calm. "The mornings I worked before sunrise? The meals I cooked and ate last? The school years I lost while your daughters went on excursions? The insults? The clothes passed to me only after everyone else rejected them? The nights Aunt Susan said I should be grateful not to be sleeping outside?" Aunt Susan opened her mouth. "Nina!" "No, Auntie," Nina said. "Let me speak. I was not brought into your house as a daughter. I was used in it as labor. If there is a bill to settle, it may not run in the direction you expect." Uncle George's face hardened. "Watch your tone." "For the first time in my life," Nina said softly, "I am watching my worth." The sentence landed with more force than a shout. Daniel reached beside him and placed a slim file on the table. "I believe," he said, "that before discussing imaginary bride obligations, we should clear older accounts." George's gaze dropped to the file. He did not touch it. Daniel opened it himself. Inside were photocopies, signatures, old fuel receipts, warehouse transfer logs, supplier records, and a sworn statement from a former supervisor. "I once told you," Daniel said, "that time exposes men. You met me as a poor trader and never asked what I knew. These documents concern the losses you helped create in my mother's company 21 years ago." Aunt Susan went pale. Diana looked from the file to her father and back as if watching a stranger emerge from his face. Ruby whispered, "Daddy?" George tried to laugh, but the sound cracked. "That is an old matter. Misunderstandings. No one can prove—" "There is enough here to begin proving," Daniel said evenly. "Enough to interest auditors. Enough to trouble old offices. Enough to stain names." The room went very still. Nina looked at the man who had once decided her future with one cruel sentence. He seemed smaller now, not because wealth had made her large, because truth had removed his stage. At last, Daniel said, "But that is not why we allowed you in." George frowned. "Allowed?" "Yes. The guard informed you that unless invited, you would wait outside. Nina chose to receive you because she wanted to end something properly." Nina stood. All eyes turned toward her. "In 2 weeks," she said, "we are opening a women's skills center in my parents' name." Aunt Susan blinked. Nina continued, "It will train widows, abandoned wives, girls pulled from school, and young women from difficult homes in tailoring, bookkeeping, food processing, and literacy support. The first training hall will carry my mother's name." Her voice did not tremble. "I wanted you to hear it from me, because my mother's brother and his wife should know what became of the girl they treated as less than family." No one spoke. "There are 2 ways this day can end," Nina said. "You can leave quietly and never again speak as though you made me. Or you can force old matters into the open and discover what public truth feels like." To Nina's surprise, Diana began to cry. Not the loud tears of drama. Small, ashamed tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, eyes lowered. "I was cruel to you." Ruby followed, her own voice shaking. "Me too." Aunt Susan stared at them in disbelief, as if apology were betrayal. Uncle George rose abruptly. His pride had nowhere left to stand. "Let us go," he muttered.
He did not apologize. Some people would rather break than bow. Aunt Susan gathered her bag with trembling fingers. Diana wiped her face. Ruby risked one quick glance at Nina before following them out. When the door shut, Nina let out a breath that felt years old. Daniel remained seated. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, then gave a brief laugh of disbelief. "I thought justice would feel hotter than this." "And what does it feel like?" "Cooler," she said. "Lighter." He smiled. "That is because justice and revenge are not twins." Preparations for the center consumed the following month. The building stood in a busy district near a market, close enough for women to reach on foot or by cheap transport, far enough from the wealthiest neighborhoods to remain honest about who it was meant for. It was not grand. That mattered to Nina. She did not want a monument to generosity. She wanted a place that worked. The walls were clean. The windows were wide. One classroom held 6 industrial sewing machines. Another contained stainless tables for food training. A third had desks and whiteboards for literacy, budgeting, and bookkeeping lessons. Outside, a covered shed was being prepared for beadwork, repair work, and fabric cutting practice. Above the entrance, a sign was fixed. The Anna and Joel Blake Center for Women's Skills and Dignity. When Nina saw her parents' names in metal letters, she cried for the first time since her wedding. Not from grief, from recognition. Opening day brought more people than expected. Widows in faded wrappers,
Teenage mothers with babies tied to their backs. Girls with guarded eyes. Women from churches. Market leaders. A local radio presenter. 2 council representatives eager to be seen supporting anything hopeful. And, to Nina's surprise, Diana and Ruby. They stood quietly at the back, modestly dressed, stripped of their old swagger. Uncle George and Aunt Susan did not come. Nina wore a simple yellow dress she had designed herself. Daniel stood near the side wall, letting the day belong to her. When she took the microphone, the room settled. "My name is Nina," she began, and her voice carried farther than she expected. "For many years, I believed survival was the highest thing a woman could ask from life. To eat, to endure, to avoid trouble, to stay useful enough not to be thrown away." A murmur moved through the audience, the murmur of women hearing themselves. "But survival is not the whole promise of life," she continued. "A woman is not born to become somebody's burden, somebody's unpaid labor, or somebody's insult. She is born with dignity." Silence deepened. Listening silence. "I know what it means to live in a house and still feel homeless. I know what it means to be useful and still be treated like waste. I know what it means to be invisible until someone needs a person to blame." Faces lifted. Tears appeared here and there. That is why this place exists, not only to teach skill, though skill matters. A woman should know how to earn, how to build, how to keep records, how to stand on her own feet. But beyond skill, this place exists to remind you that your life is not over because someone spoke badly over you. Applause rose and fell. Nina looked toward the last row and saw a girl no older than 16, clutching a baby blanket with both hands and staring as if the words were water. "No insult is prophecy," Nina said. "No rejection is heaven's final decision over your future. And kindness is not weakness. Let the world laugh at a kind heart if it wants to. Character survives storms that beauty, noise, and borrowed pride cannot survive." By the time she finished, women were standing. Some clapped, some cried, some did both. After the speeches, applications opened at once. The line stretched past the doorway. Mina moved among them, helping one woman fill out her form, showing another where to sit, kneeling beside a shy teenager who could barely write her own name. Later, the radio presenter said that what made the event powerful was not the building. not even the money behind it. It was the fact that the founder looked at every applicant as if she remembered being one. She did. Days developed their own rhythm. Mornings were for planning meetings, afternoons for the training rooms, evenings for tea with Daniel on the veranda, sharing the strange gratitude of people who know life could easily have become something much smaller. One evening, as sunset spread bronze across the garden walls, Daniel asked, "Do you miss them?" Nina knew who he meant. She thought for a while. "I miss who I hoped they might become," she said. "Not who they were." "That is honest." She turned toward him. "Do you ever regret testing people?" He leaned back and considered. "Sometimes. Not because the method fails, because it often confirms ugly truths." "And yet, you kept doing it." "Yes." "Why?" A faint smile touched his face. "Because every once in a while, it reveals someone like you." There are moments in marriage when love does not arrive like thunder. It arrives like recognition. That was one of those moments. Not the first, not the last, but one Nina carried quietly within herself. Months later, the center graduated its first group. 7 women in tailoring, 5 in catering, 3 in bookkeeping support, 2 in basic machine maintenance, 1 in fabric sourcing and resale. Their stories spread quickly. One widow opened a school uniform stall. Another began a snack business, supplying church events and naming ceremonies. A girl who had nearly been forced into marriage began earning enough from repair work to return to evening classes. Nina saw something clearly then. Mercy multiplies when it is organized, not merely felt, built, protected, scaled. So she and Daniel began planning a second center, then a third, not recklessly, step by step, the way lasting things grow. Around that same time, an invitation arrived from a girls' school in a nearby district, asking Nina to speak at their leadership day. She nearly declined. "I'm not a polished speaker," she told Daniel. "You are a truthful one," he replied. "That is rarer." So she went. The assembly hall was full of girls in uniforms, some noisy, some shy, some already carrying more pain than children should have to carry. Nina stood before them with no grand speech prepared, only memory. "When people do not recognize your value," she said, "they often give you chores instead of chances." The girls laughed softly, then listened harder. "Do not let that deceive you into thinking you are small. Sometimes the world gives its hardest work to the people it secretly depends on." She spoke about education, self-respect, learning a skill, guarding the heart against bitterness, how kindness does not mean tolerating abuse, how silence is holy only when chosen, not when forced upon you. At the end, a girl in the front row raised her hand. "What if your own family is the one hurting you?" The hall grew still. Nina did not hurry her answer. "Then your healing may begin before their apology," she said gently. "And your future must not wait for their permission." Several teachers turned away to wipe their eyes. On the drive home, Nina repeated the sentence softly. "Healing may begin before their apology." Daniel glanced at her. "That sounded like an answer you needed too." "I did," she admitted. "Good," he said. Later that year, Nina asked Daniel to take her to her parents' graves. He agreed at once. They drove without staff, without announcement, without convoy. Only the two of them, a driver and a bouquet of white lilies resting between them on the seat. The cemetery lay at the edge of town, quiet and modest beneath tall neem trees that had grown higher since Nina last stood there as a grief-struck girl. She found the graves quickly. 2 weathered stones side by side. Simple. Still. She knelt and laid down the flowers. For a long time she said nothing. Then, in a voice only heaven and dust could hear, she whispered, "I came to tell you that I survived." Wind moved lightly through the grass. "And I also came to tell you that survival was not the end." Tears slid down her face, but her mouth smiled. "I am safe. I am loved. Your names are spoken with honor. Women are being helped because of what you planted in me before you left." Behind her, Daniel waited at a respectful distance. Nina touched the stone bearing her mother's name. "They tried to turn your daughter into a servant of shame," she said softly. "But God remembered me." When she rose at last, her knees ached, but her spirit felt clear. As they walked back, she said, "I want to start scholarships too." Daniel looked amused. "The centers are no longer enough?" "They are enough for now," Nina said, "but not for the whole dream." He smiled. "Then let us build toward the whole dream." Years passed. Not in a blur, in layers. The first center became 3, then 6. The foundation partnered with churches, market associations, women-led cooperatives, and local schools. Training expanded into soap making, poultry management, digital bookkeeping, textile design, packaging, and small-scale distribution. Mobile trainers began traveling to smaller towns. Scholarships were added for girls withdrawn from school after bereavement or financial collapse. A legal support desk opened twice a month for women facing property seizure, guardian abuse, and inheritance disputes. People began calling Nina Mama Nina, even those older than she was. Not because of age, because of shelter. There were interviews, magazine features, radio invitations. Awards she accepted with grace and redirected toward the women doing the difficult work on the ground. Whenever journalists asked for the secret behind her success, expecting polished leadership jargon or motivational phrases, Nina answered in a way that always surprised them. The turning point, she would say, was being seen. And the foundation of everything after that was refusing to let suffering turn me cruel. One reporter once asked, "So you're saying kindness made you successful?" Nina smiled. "No. I'm saying kindness kept me human long enough to survive the season before success." The quote spread everywhere. Meanwhile, Diana and Ruby changed slowly. Real repentance is usually slow. Diana began volunteering at the Second Center on weekends, helping with literacy classes, after admitting that shame alone was not the same as transformation. Ruby, who had always been quicker with words than discipline, took longer. But in time, she began managing distribution records for donated materials and scholarship supplies. They never became saints, but they became better. Sometimes that, too, is a miracle. Uncle George remained proud until illness humbled him. When his small repair shed failed and debts gathered around him, no wealthy friends came. No political contacts answered. No old boasts paid the clinic bills. It was Nina who sent medicine quietly. Not cash into his hands. Medicine, groceries, hospital deposits arranged through the foundation's clinic partner. When Daniel learned of it, he asked, "Are you sure?" Nina's answer was simple. "I do not want his suffering. I wanted freedom from his power." Aunt Susan sent a message through Ruby after the third package arrived. She wanted to come and thank Nina in person. Nina agreed. The woman who entered her office that day hardly resembled the sharp-tongued ruler of years before. Age had softened her face, but regret had done more. She sat without elegance, without performance. For a while, she could not speak. Then finally, she said, "I thought cruelty made a house strong." Nina said nothing. Aunt Susan looked down at her own hands. "I was wrong." It was not a dramatic apology. No collapse to the floor. No flood of tears. Just truth. Plain, late. Sometimes late truth is still worth receiving. Nina nodded slowly. Yes, she said, you were. Aunt Susan looked up in surprise, perhaps expecting comfort. Instead, Nina gave her honesty. Then, after a pause, she added, but being wrong is not the end if you let it teach you. That meeting did not erase the past. Nothing could. But it laid one final stone over the grave of the old power that house once held over Nina's life. One dry season evening, years after the wedding that began in mockery, Nina and Daniel sat beneath the veranda lights, watching trainees laugh as they loaded fabric rolls into a van for a regional fair. You know, Daniel said, the whole city still tells our story badly. Nina smiled. Which version? The one where they say, I disguised myself to find a wife. She laughed. Did you not? He tilted his head. Partly. But I also disguised myself because I no longer trusted houses that greeted wealth better than truth. Nina reached for his hand. And did you find what you were looking for? He looked at her for a long moment. I found more. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder. In the courtyard below, a young trainee cried out with delight because she had sold her first completed dresses to a shop owner from another district. The other women clapped for her. Someone began singing. Another joined in. The sound rose into the evening air. Bright, full, alive. Nina listened, and inside that music, she heard every version of herself she had once been. The girl scrubbing pots before sunrise. The orphan wearing a stained hand-me-down dress to her own wedding. The frightened bride stepping into a stranger's car. The woman standing before a microphone and speaking dignity into rooms full of wounded people. All of those selves still lived inside her. But none of them were trapped anymore. At last, she understood something her younger self could never have imagined. You do not always win by returning pain. Sometimes you win by becoming living proof that pain did not own you. And somewhere, in homes where girls were being overworked, mocked, ignored, and underestimated, her story began traveling to ears that needed it. Not as fantasy, as witness, as comfort, as warning, as promise. That a cruel house is not the end of a life. That a quiet heart is not an empty one. That the people who dismiss you may one day be forced to learn your worth from a distance. And that sometimes the stranger everyone laughs at is carrying the answer to prayers you were too tired to keep praying. So if you are hearing this story while sitting in a room where nobody sees your effort, hear this clearly. What they call small may be sacred. What they dismiss may be your seed. And what they tried to bury may yet become shelter for many. That was Nina's legacy. Not that she married wealth. Not that she escaped hunger. Not even that truth eventually found the people who wronged her. Her deepest legacy was this: she stayed kind without becoming weak. She became strong without becoming hard. And when life finally opened its hand to her, she filled that hand with doors for other people. That is how a burden became a blessing. That is how a rejected girl became a refuge. That is how a wedding arranged in mockery became the beginning of a kingdom built on dignity. Sometimes life doesn't change in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it changes because one person chooses kindness when bitterness would be easier. Nina's story reminds us that being rejected doesn't mean you are worthless. Being ignored doesn't mean you are invisible. And being mistreated doesn't mean that is all life has planned for you. For years, Nina carried pain she never deserved. Yet she refused to let that pain turn her into someone cruel. And in the end, it wasn't her beauty, her circumstances, or even her luck that changed her future. It was her character. Maybe today you feel overlooked. Maybe you're working hard and nobody notices. Maybe you're carrying burdens that others cannot see. If so, remember Nina's journey. The season you are in today is not necessarily the place where your story ends. Sometimes the people who underestimate you are only witnessing the beginning of your story, not the final chapter. This is Adrian, and thank you for spending these moments with me. If Nina's story touched your heart, inspired you, or reminded you never to give up, please like this video, subscribe to African Soul Tales by Adrian, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story.